That night, 3 unmarked cars blocked Reed Gallagher's convoy on a forest road outside Austin. Headlights cut off all at once. Engines died. Then gunfire tore through the dark. Reed pressed himself flat against the back seat. Boone clenched his jaw and floored it, plowing straight through the gap between the 2 lead cars. The windshield cracked. Bullets punched into the frame. But in that chaos, something happened that Reed couldn't stop. The door flew open, and Rook charged out. The massive Neapolitan Mastiff launched herself into the darkness, straight toward the ambush. The instinct to protect her owner, same as every time before. But this time, Rook didn't come back. Reed shouted the dog's name. Boone didn't stop the car. He wasn't allowed to stop. By sunrise, all they found was a smear of blood along the edge of a forest cliff, and drag marks on the wet ground trailing down into the darkness below. No Rook, no barking, nothing. That was 3 months ago. Reed Gallagher, the man whose name no one in the Texas underworld dared to speak, never found his dog. But he never stopped looking either. If you want to know what happens next to Reed and Rook, hit like to support this story. Share the video with animal lovers and with anyone who loves stories full of unexpected turns. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you won't miss the next part. And today's story began there. The next morning, before the mist had even had time to lift from the treetops, Reed was already in the woods. Boone brought 8 men with him, split them into 2 groups, and swept along the edge of the cliff where Rook had disappeared. They found a skid mark stretching more than 10 meters down the slope, a few streaks of gray-black fur caught on broken branches, and then nothing more. Below them was dense forest, tangled shrubs layered over one another, with visibility no more than a few meters. Reed ordered his men to go all the way down to the bottom of the cliff. They searched the entire day. There was no Rook, no paw prints on the rotting leaves. Nothing to prove the dog was still alive, but nothing to prove she was dead, either. Reed didn't say a word on the drive back. Boone drove, glanced into the rearview mirror, and saw Reed sitting there, staring out through the window, his hand resting on the leather collar he had taken from the storage box in the car. Reed had had that collar custom-made for Rook 3 years earlier, from a single piece of cowhide, with her name engraved on the inside. Now it lay in his hand, weightless, meaningless. On the 2nd day, Reed went back. On the 3rd day, he did the same. He hired more men and widened the search area to 2 kilometers around the place where Rook had fallen. The first week passed with no result. In the 2nd week, one of the search team found a dry, reddish stain on a rock at the foot of the cliff. They reported it to Reed. He came, looked at it, said nothing, and then ordered them to keep searching. By the 3rd week, Boone began to worry. Not for Rook, but for Reed. This man had never let anything occupy his mind for this long. Reed Gallagher controlled a network that stretched across Texas, ran Gallagher Holdings with hundreds of millions of dollars in annual revenue, and made decisions that affected the lives of hundreds of people without the slightest hesitation. But for the past 3 weeks, he had canceled 4 meetings and postponed 2 deals, just to stand in the middle of the woods and call the name of a dog. The 1st month came to an end. There was no Rook. In the 2nd month, Reed expanded the search one last time, ordering a full sweep of the eastern forest, the area Rook might have crawled toward if she was still alive. The search team spent 2 full weeks out there. They came back empty-handed. Boone stood in front of Reed's desk, waited for him to look up, and then spoke plainly. It's been 60 days. If she was still alive, she would have found her way back. Maybe she's gone, Reed. Reed didn't look at Boone. He looked at the collar lying on the desk, right beside the stack of files and the 2 phones. Then he said, his voice flat and steady, "Stop the search, but no one tells me she's dead until they've seen a body." Boone nodded and walked out. From that day on, no one in the organization mentioned Rook in front of Reed. The leather collar stayed on his desk, exactly where it had been, and no one dared move it. The passenger seat in Reed's car, the place where Rook had always sat whenever she rode with him, remained empty. Boone didn't put anything there, neither did the new driver. Everyone understood without needing an explanation. There was one thing very few people knew. Rook had been pregnant before the night of the ambush. Reed had arranged the breeding himself with a male mastiff from the most reputable kennel in the South. He knew Rook would give birth within a few months. He had already prepared a place for the litter and chosen the person who would care for them. All of it meant nothing now. Reed hadn't lost a dog. He had lost the dog who had saved his life, and the entire litter he would never get to see. Or at least, that was what he thought then. 3 months after that night, nearly 40 kilometers south of the woods where Rook had disappeared, Noelle Ashford drove her old pickup truck along the forest road that led back to her house. The clock on the dashboard showed almost 2 o'clock in the morning. Her night shift at the veterinary clinic had just ended, and the smell of antiseptic still clung to her sleeves. Noelle was 27 years old, living alone in a small rented house at the edge of the woods, where the nearest neighbor was still more than half a kilometer away. No one was waiting for her at home. No one texted to ask what time she'd be back. She'd been used to that for a long time, ever since her parents died in a traffic accident 5 years earlier, leaving her behind with debt and a life she had to manage on her own, one day at a time. The headlights swept across a bend in the road, and Noelle saw it. A large black shape lay motionless by the roadside, right beneath the old oak tree. She slowed down. Her first thought was that it was a wild animal hit by a car, a common enough sight on this stretch of road. She parked, took the flashlight from the door compartment, and stepped out. The night was so quiet that she could hear her shoes crushing the dry leaves beneath them. She switched on the flashlight and aimed it toward the dark shape. Then she stopped. It wasn't a wild animal. It was a dog. A dog so large that Noelle had never seen anything like it in real life. A Neapolitan Mastiff, its gray-black coat matted with dirt, the deep folds of skin that marked the breed covering its face and neck. The dog was curled into itself, and beneath its belly, Noelle saw a tiny puppy tucked close against her, its eyes still shut. Her veterinarian's instinct rose at once. Noelle watched from a distance of 4 meters, the flashlight giving her just enough light to read the dog's condition. There was a long scar across the left shoulder, healed long ago, the skin drawn together into a slightly raised line. It wasn't a fresh wound. The right front leg was swollen, the fur around the joint almost completely gone, the skin red and inflamed, clearly infected. The ribs showed beneath the wrinkled skin. This dog hadn't been hit by a car. This dog had been living out here for a long time. Rook heard the footsteps. Her head lifted, her eyes fixed straight on the beam of the flashlight, and a low growl rose from deep inside her chest. The Mastiff tried to stand, bracing her front legs against the ground, but the injured leg buckled at once. Rook fell back down, her body tipping to one side, but immediately she twisted herself around to shield the puppy behind her. The growling didn't stop. Noelle stopped at once. She didn't take even half a step closer. She'd been doing this job long enough to know there was nothing more dangerous than a dog protecting her young in the dark, especially a Mastiff that probably weighed more than 50 kilograms, even as thin as she was. She set the flashlight down on the ground, letting the beam cut sideways across the road instead of shining straight into the dog's eyes. Then she backed away a few steps and sat down by the roadside, silent, saying nothing, not moving. Rook watched her. The growling grew softer, but it didn't fully die. The dog's body stayed tense, her eyes still locked on Noelle, her ears alert, ready. The puppy behind her burrowed deeper against its mother's belly, letting out a faint whimper. Noelle sat there for 15 minutes, motionless. She looked at the Mastiff, and the Mastiff looked back at her. In Noelle's mind, she was calculating. If the infection in the leg wasn't treated, it would spread. The dog was too thin, and if she was nursing without enough nutrition, her milk would dry up soon. The puppy was far too small, probably less than 3 weeks old. If they stayed in these conditions for a few more days, both of them would have a hard time surviving. But tonight, there was nothing she could do yet. Noelle stood up slowly and walked back to the truck. She opened the rear bed and took out the old blanket she still used to line the floor of the vehicle whenever she brought animals home from the clinic. She came back, stopped 3 meters away, and gently tossed the blanket toward the place where the puppy lay. Not at Rook, at the empty space right beside her. Rook growled, her body jerking slightly when the blanket landed less than half a meter from her. But the dog didn't shove it away. She didn't bite it. She didn't lunge. She only growled, and then went still. Noelle got into the truck, started the engine, and drove home. In the rearview mirror, the flashlight still lay on the road, casting a small streak of light toward the base of the oak tree where the Mastiff lay with her child. Noelle knew she would come back in the morning. She didn't know who this dog was, where she had come from, or what she had survived. But she knew one thing. That dog was trying to live, not for herself, but for the child beneath her belly. And Noelle understood that feeling. The feeling of forcing yourself to keep standing for something more important than yourself, even when you no longer had any strength left. The next morning, Noelle returned to the same place. She came early, while the air was still hazy with mist, with just enough light to see the old oak tree where she had found the mastiff the night before. Rook was still there, lying in the same position, in the same spot. But something had changed. The blanket Noelle had thrown there last night was no longer lying on the ground. Rook had dragged it over, using either her muzzle or her paw to pull the blanket over the puppy. The little one was curled inside it, warm, quiet, and deeply asleep. Noelle looked at that scene and understood at once. This dog hadn't pushed the blanket away because she knew her child needed it. She hated people, but she didn't hate something that helped her baby. Noelle opened her bag and took out a plastic container filled with boiled chicken she had cooked before dawn, along with a bottle of clean water, which she poured into an old aluminum bowl. She set both down on the ground, about 5 meters from Rook, then sat down by the roadside, in the same place where she had sat the night before. She didn't look straight at Rook. She looked down at the ground, toward the woods, anywhere else. Rook lifted her head, her nose twitching, the smell of boiled chicken. The dog looked at Noelle, looked at the food container, then looked back at Noelle. She didn't growl, but she didn't move either. 10 minutes passed. Noelle stood up, brushed the dust from her pants, and walked back to the truck. She didn't look back. She drove away, knowing that if she turned around, the dog would feel watched. That afternoon, on her way to work, Noelle stopped by. The food container was empty. The water bowl was dry. Rook lay in the same place, watching her from a distance, not growling, not getting up, only watching. On the second day, Noelle came at the same morning hour, bringing chicken and water. She set them down at the same distance and sat in the same place. Rook watched every movement she made, but she didn't react as violently as she had on the first night. Noelle sat for 10 minutes, then left. When she came back that afternoon, the food was gone. On the third day, after Noelle set down the food, she sat. This time, she stayed longer, nearly 20 minutes. She didn't look at Rook, but she heard her. The heavy steps on the dry leaves, the rough, labored breathing. Noelle glanced from the corner of her eye. Rook was getting up, slowly, her injured leg dragging slightly as she stepped toward the food container. The dog stopped half a meter from it, looked at Noelle one more time, then lowered her head and ate. Noelle still hadn't left. Rook ate while she was still sitting there, for the first time. Noelle didn't move, didn't turn her head, didn't breathe too hard. She simply sat still until Rook finished eating, drank the water, and returned to the place where the puppy lay. Only then did Noelle stand and go home. A week passed in that rhythm. Come in the morning, set down the food, sit, wait, leave, stop by again in the afternoon to check. Rook gradually grew used to Noelle's presence. The dog no longer growled when Noelle came within 5 meters, then 4 meters, then 3. But every time Noelle reached out her hand, even very slowly, Rook growled. A low growl, not as fierce as it had been that first night, but clear enough to say, "Not yet, not now, don't touch me." Noelle pulled her hand back every time. She didn't force it, she didn't push, but after 7 days, she began to feel tired. Not tired because of the dog, but tired because of everything added together. After finishing the night shift, she still had to wake early in the morning to bring food into the woods. Chicken, antiseptic, gauze, saline solution, all of it came out of her own pocket. The clinic didn't pay extra for the animals she picked up off the roadside. A veterinarian's salary at a small suburban clinic wasn't exactly generous, and she was still paying off the debt her parents had left behind. On the 8th day, Noelle sat by the road, less than 3 meters from Rook. The dog lay there, watching her. The puppy crawled out from under its mother's belly, toddled a few steps, then rolled back to the same place. Noelle looked at the mother and child, then suddenly spoke aloud. Not to Rook, to herself, perhaps, or maybe to the empty space around her. "I don't know if you really need me." Her voice wasn't sad. It wasn't angry. It was only tired. Tired in the way of someone who had grown used to giving and getting nothing back, and sometimes wondered whether it was worth it at all. Rook lifted her head. The dog's eyes looked straight at Noelle. No growl. For the first time in 8 days, Rook looked at her without making a single sound. She only looked, with dark brown, heavy eyes, the kind of eyes that belonged to an animal that had seen too much. That moment lasted perhaps only a few seconds. But Noelle felt it. It wasn't trust. Not yet. But it was the first time Rook didn't see her as a threat. And for Noelle, that was enough to stay. That night, the rain came down. Not a light rain, but forest rain. The hard, drenching kind that Texas knew too well in this season, with violent gusts of wind and water running in streams across the road. Noelle lay inside the house, listening to the rain strike the tin roof, and thought of Rook. There was no shelter beneath that oak tree. The ground around it was forest soil, quick to absorb water, but the surface would still flood slightly. The puppy was only a little more than 3 weeks old. In this cold rain, if it stayed wet all night, it would be very hard for it to survive. Noelle put on her coat, took the flashlight, and opened the door to the porch. Then she stopped. Rook was lying right there, right on the steps of her porch. The enormous mastiff lay pressed against the wall, her body soaked through, mud clinging from her belly down to her legs. And beneath her belly, the puppy lay curled up, shivering, but drier because Rook had used her entire body to shield her child from the rain. Noelle understood at once. Rook hadn't come because she trusted her. Rook had come because the puppy needed shelter. The dog had dragged herself nearly 400 meters from the oak tree to this house, with an infected leg, through pouring rain, either carrying the puppy in her mouth or pushing the little one ahead of her. A mother's instinct had overpowered the instinct to fear. Noelle said nothing. She opened the porch door wider, went back inside, took 2 more dry blankets, and laid them out on the porch floor, less than a meter from Rook. Then she stepped back into the house and closed the door. She didn't try to touch Rook. She didn't try to pick up the puppy. She did nothing except leave the dog free to decide for herself. The next morning, the rain had stopped. Noelle opened the door to the porch. Rook was lying on the blanket. The puppy curled beside her, both of them dry and warm. Rook lifted her head and looked at Noelle, but she didn't stand, didn't growl. Noelle brought out food and set it right beside Rook, close enough that she could hear the dog's heavy breathing. Rook lowered her head and ate, no growling, no suspicious watching. She only ate, then lay back down, her eyes half closed. From that rainy night on, Rook never returned to the old oak tree again. The dog stayed on Noelle's porch, and Noelle never once forced her to come inside. 3 days after the rainy night, Noelle sat on the porch beside Rook, closer than she had ever been before. She kept her hand on her thigh, not reaching out, not pulling back, simply leaving it there where Rook could see it. The mastiff lay on her side, her injured front leg stretched out in front of her, the joint swollen and red, the fur around it almost completely gone. The infection hadn't gotten worse, thanks to the antibiotics Noelle had been mixing into her food for the past few days, but the wound needed to be treated directly. She couldn't keep hiding medicine in the food forever. Noelle took a bottle of antiseptic and a roll of gauze from her bag. She opened the cap and let the medicinal smell drift lightly into the air. Rook sniffed, her nose wrinkling, but she didn't move. Noelle reached out, slowly, centimeter by centimeter, toward the injured leg. Rook watched her hand. The dog's body tightened, the muscles in her shoulders shifting faintly beneath her skin. Noelle stopped with her hand a handspan from Rook's leg. She waited. Rook looked at her hand, looked up at her face, then looked back at her hand. Then she stayed still. No growl, no pulling her leg away. Noelle touched her. Her fingertips rested on the skin just above the joint, gentle, as if touching something fragile. Rook shuddered, her muscles jerking once, but her leg stayed where it was. Noelle soaked the gauze with antiseptic and began cleaning the infected area. Rook whimpered softly, her head turning to one side, but she didn't bite, didn't pull her leg back, didn't get up and leave. The dog lay there, enduring the pain, her eyes fixed on the yard, as if trying not to think about what was happening to her leg. From that day on, Noelle treated her every day. Early each morning before work, she sat out on the porch, cleaned the wound, changed the bandage, and applied medicine. Rook lay still every time, without resisting. The puppy crawled around Noelle's feet while she worked, sometimes climbing into her lap, sometimes chewing at her shoelaces. Rook watched her baby near Noelle and didn't react. That was the biggest change of all. After about 5 days of treatment, the swelling began to go down. Noelle examined her more carefully, her hands moving along Rook's leg up to the shoulder, down her back, feeling the joints and checking the muscles. When her hand passed over Rook's neck, she stopped. Beneath the thick fur and the deep folds of skin that marked the mastiff breed, her fingers touched an indentation. She parted the fur and looked closely. A shallow groove ran all the way around Rook's neck, even and steady, about 3 centimeters wide. The mark of a collar that had been worn for a very long time, and then lost. Not a cheap fabric collar or an iron chain. The groove was smooth and even, the kind of mark only a real leather collar, custom made to size and worn snugly for a long time, could leave behind. Noelle sat back and looked at Rook. The dog lay still, her eyes half closed, letting Noelle touch her without protest. Noelle said quietly, "Sit." Rook opened her eyes and sat up, immediately. Back straight, front legs planted evenly, head lifted, perfect posture, not even slightly off. Noelle held her breath. She said again, "Down." Rook lay down, neatly, quickly, precisely, the way a dog lies down after being trained hundreds of times, until the command has sunk into her bones, until even 3 months of surviving wild couldn't erase it. Noelle sat there, looking at the mastiff lying before her in a posture of obedience, and understood that she had been wrong from the beginning. This wasn't a stray dog. This wasn't an abandoned dog. This dog had belonged to someone with enough money to order a custom leather collar, someone with enough patience, or enough money to hire a trainer, to train her this well, and someone was missing her. The next day, Noelle took Rook to the clinic. The mastiff climbed into her pickup truck, without needing to be coaxed, and sat quietly on the floor of the vehicle the entire way, the puppy lying between her 2 front legs. At the clinic, Noelle used the chip scanner. She passed the reader over the back of Rook's neck, her shoulders, and her spine. No signal. No chip. Whoever had raised this dog had chosen not to microchip her, and Noelle knew enough to understand that some people didn't want their animals to be traceable. She didn't ask her coworkers. She didn't tell anyone. She went home, took 3 photos of Rook, chose the clearest one, and posted it in 3 animal rescue groups in the Austin area. The post was brief. Female Neapolitan Mastiff, old scar on left shoulder, mark from a leather collar, knows basic English commands, found in a wooded area south of Austin, currently being cared for at home. Owner, please contact. After posting it, she set her phone down and looked out toward the porch, where Rook was lying with her puppy. She didn't know whose hands that post would reach. She also didn't know that in less than 24 hours, it would change her life completely. At the same time, more than 40 kilometers north of Noelle's house, Reed Gallagher was sitting at the head of the conference table, on the top floor of the Gallagher Holdings building in downtown Austin. The room was wide, with tempered glass looking out over the entire western skyline, and a long black oak table large enough to seat 12 people. Today, there were only 6, 4 partners from a construction company who wanted to collaborate on a new suburban development project outside San Antonio, Boone, standing beside the door, and Reed. The meeting had already gone on for more than an hour. Everything was moving in the right direction until the man sitting across from Reed, a middle-aged man named Warren, the chief financial officer for the partner company, opened his mouth and said something no one in the room expected. Warren set his hand on the stack of files in front of him, leaned forward, and said the profit-sharing terms Reed had proposed were unreasonable, that their side deserved more, and that if Reed wouldn't adjust them, perhaps they should find another partner. Warren's voice was confident, the kind of confidence that belonged to someone who had never sat across from Reed Gallagher long enough to understand the rules. The conference room went silent. The other 3 people on the partner's side looked at Warren, then at Reed. Boone, beside the door, drew in a quiet breath. Reed didn't get angry. He didn't raise an eyebrow. He didn't change his posture. He simply stopped speaking and looked at Warren. Silence. 1 second. 2 seconds. 5 seconds. 10 seconds. The kind of silence no one in the room dared to break. The kind of silence heavier than any threat, because it forced the person across from him to ask himself what he had just said wrong. Warren began to shift in his chair. His hand moved away from the stack of files. Reed opened his mouth, his voice flat, neither rising nor falling. "You just said you wanted to find another partner. The door is behind you. I don't keep anyone in this room." Warren didn't stand. No one stood. Warren swallowed, gave a slight nod, and sat back into the proper position. The meeting ended 5 minutes later. The terms remained unchanged. No one questioned them again. The 4 people from the partner company shook Reed's hand and left the room. Boone closed the door behind them. Only Reed remained in the room. He didn't stand up right away. He stayed seated, his eyes turned toward the glass, but seeing nothing at all. On his desk, right beside the stack of files and the 2 phones, lay a leather collar, dark brown, made from a single piece of cowhide, its edge slightly worn near the buckle. The only personal detail in a room filled entirely with papers and screens. It had been there for 3 months. For 3 months, no one had dared ask what it was. Boone knocked on the door and stepped inside. Normally, Boone only entered when he was called, but this time, he didn't wait. Boone walked straight to Reed's desk and set his phone down, the screen already open. Reed looked down. On the screen was a post in an animal rescue group in the Austin area. 3 photos. A female Neapolitan Mastiff, thin, with gray-black fur, lying on the porch of a small house, and on the dog's left shoulder, a long scar running from the shoulder blade down toward the elbow. Beneath the photo was the description. Female Neapolitan Mastiff, old scar on left shoulder, mark from a leather collar, knows English commands, found in a wooded area south of Austin. Reed looked at the photo. He said nothing. His finger enlarged the first image and stopped at the scar. Then he swiped to the second one. A close-up of the dog's face. The familiar wrinkles, the heavy dark brown eyes, the broad muzzle. He knew that face. He had looked at that face every day for 3 years. Reed set the phone down on the desk. His hand touched the leather collar lying beside it, only for a moment, his fingertips brushing over the worn edge of the leather, then pulling away. He stood. Boone asked, "How many men should I bring?" Reed had already started toward the door. He didn't turn back. "None." Boone didn't ask again. He knew that when Reed said none, it meant none. But Boone also knew his job. 3 minutes later, Boone was behind the wheel of Reed's car, driving out of the underground parking garage beneath Gallagher Holdings. 200 meters behind them, 2 other black cars followed silently. Reed sat in the back seat, his eyes straight ahead, not saying a word through the entire 40-minute drive south of Austin. On the desk at the top floor, the leather collar still lay there, but this time, perhaps it wouldn't have to lie alone much longer. The car stopped in front of the small house at the edge of the woods. Boone turned off the engine and glanced at Reed in the rearview mirror. Reed said nothing. He opened the door and stepped out. Boone understood. He stayed in the car, his eyes sweeping quickly over the surroundings, before he leaned back in the driver's seat. 2 black cars were parked about 200 meters away, silent beneath the trees. Reed walked along the narrow path that led from the road to the porch. The house was smaller than he had imagined. The white paint had yellowed with age. The roof was made of tin. The wooden porch was narrow, and the steps rose only 2 levels from the ground. There was no fence around the front yard, only a patch of short grass and an old plastic table pushed close to the wall. Reed stepped onto the porch and knocked on the door. 3 knocks, even, unhurried. Inside, there was the soft sound of footsteps. The door opened. Noelle stood at the threshold, looking out. In front of her was a man she had never seen before. He was almost a head taller than she was, with neatly combed black hair, a dark suit, and polished leather shoes. The kind of man who didn't belong on this forest road, or in any house in this outlying stretch of country. His eyes looked at her, cold and unreadable, the eyes of someone used to watching people without letting anything inside him show. Noelle was about to open her mouth and ask what he needed, when she heard the sound of claws tapping against the wooden floor behind her. Rook came out from inside the house. The Mastiff moved slowly, heavily, her injured front leg less swollen now, though still dragging slightly. Rook passed Noelle's legs, reached the threshold, and stopped. She didn't charge. She didn't jump. She didn't bark. She only stopped. Rook's nose drew in the air. Once. Twice. The dog's whole body changed in that moment. Her ears lifted. Her tail went stiff, then began to wag. Slowly at first, then faster, then so hard that her entire hindquarters moved with it. Rook looked at Reed, and dropped to her front legs. The whole front of her body sank onto the porch floor. Both front legs stretched straight out before her, her head lowered, her muzzle nearly touching the ground. It was the perfect posture of submission, the kind Rook had been trained into long ago, the kind she had performed hundreds of times in front of Reed. But this time was different. This time, Rook whimpered, a soft, drawn-out whimper, rising from deep inside her chest. The kind of sound dogs make only when they recognize something they have lost for a very long time. Not because of a command, because of memory. Reed stood still. He looked at the dog lying before him on the porch floor of a stranger's house. The dog he had searched for through 2 long months. The dog he had thought he might never see again. She was thinner than he remembered, smaller than she had been in his memory. The scar on her left shoulder was clear even in the afternoon light, but she was here. She was alive. She recognized him. Reed let out a long breath. His hand tightened into a fist at his side, then loosened. Then he sat down, slowly, not kneeling, not collapsing, but choosing to sit on the porch floor, slowly, carefully, as if he were afraid that if he moved too fast, everything in front of him would vanish. He sat on the old wooden boards, right in front of Rook. His right hand reached out and settled on the dog's head. Rook pressed her nose into his palm, wet, cold, pushing firmly against his skin, just the way Rook had done every night when Reed sat working and the dog lay beside his feet. Exactly the same, unchanged after 3 months. Reed didn't speak. His hand moved along Rook's head, over her ear, down to her neck, to the place where the leather collar used to sit. Rook whimpered again, her tail never stopping, her muzzle pressing into Reed's wrist, then against his chest. From inside the house came the faint scraping sound of something crawling across the floor. The puppy appeared at the threshold, toddling forward, tripping over its own feet, rolling once, then getting up and continuing on. It crawled straight to Reed, climbed onto his lap, curled up, and sat there. Reed looked down. The puppy was small enough to fit in his 2 hands, with gray-black fur like its mother's, and wide-open eyes looking up at him. Rook's child, the child Reed had believed, 3 months earlier, had been lost with Rook in the rain beneath the forest cliff. He had thought he'd lost them both, but both of them were here. Noelle stood in the doorway, her hand still resting on the doorknob, watching everything. She watched the man in the expensive suit sitting on the floor of her porch, a massive dog pressing her muzzle into his chest, and a puppy curled on his lap. His eyes were red. His jaw was tight, the kind of tightness that belonged to someone holding something powerful inside and refusing to let it spill out. He couldn't say anything. Noelle didn't need him to. She saw the way Rook pressed herself against him, the way the dog kept whimpering softly, the way her tail wagged so hard her whole body shook with it. She understood. This was Rook's owner. Reed sat on the porch floor for nearly 5 minutes before he stood. He drew in a breath, stroked Rook's head one last time, then rose and lightly brushed off the leg of his pants. His face had returned to what it had been before. Flat, unreadable. He looked at Noelle, gave a slight nod, and said briefly, "Thank you for taking care of her. I'm this dog's owner." Noelle looked at him and didn't answer right away. She looked down at Rook, then back at Reed. "I know," Reed continued, his voice still as level as it had been in the conference room. "I'll take her home." He stepped beside Rook, his hand patting the dog lightly on the hip. "Come, Rook." Rook stood. The mastiff followed Reed, slowly, across the threshold, out onto the porch, and down the steps. 2 steps, 3 steps along the narrow path leading to the road. Then Rook stopped. The dog turned her head and looked back. She looked at Noelle standing in the doorway. Then she looked inside the house, where the puppy was lying on the old cushion in the corner of the living room. Rook looked at Reed, looked back at Noelle, looked into the house. Then the dog lay down, right in the middle of the path, on the dirt, all 4 legs folding beneath her, her body settling low. She didn't move. Reed looked down. "Rook, come." Rook didn't stand. For the first time in her life, the dog didn't obey Reed Gallagher's command. Not because she didn't recognize her owner. Not because she had forgotten, but because now, Rook had something else besides Reed. There was a puppy lying on a cushion inside the house. There was the porch where she had been treated every morning. There was the woman who had sat by the roadside every day for more than a week. Not forcing, not pushing, only waiting until Rook was ready. Rook wasn't leaving Reed. But Rook couldn't leave Noelle. Reed stood there, looking at the dog lying in the middle of the path. He didn't call a 3rd time. He understood. He turned back toward the porch and looked at Noelle. "This dog followed me for 3 years. She's never disobeyed a command." Noelle said nothing. She didn't need to. The scene in front of them had already said everything. Reed stood still for a moment, then said, "I'll reimburse you for the cost of caring for her. Medicine, food, everything." Noelle shook her head. "There's no need. You've cared for her for weeks. Her leg, her wound, the puppy. You paid out of pocket. I said there's no need. Noelle's voice wasn't sharp, wasn't cold, only clear. Clear in the way of someone who had grown, used to taking care of everything herself, and didn't like owing anyone. Reed looked at her. He had met enough people to know when someone said no, and truly meant no. This woman truly meant no. He looked down at Rook, still lying in the middle of the path, then looked into the house, where the puppy was wriggling on the cushion. Then he said, "Her leg hasn't fully healed. The puppy's still small. If I take her now, she won't be at peace." Noelle listened and waited. "Keep caring for her, until she's fully recovered. I'll come visit." It wasn't a question. It was the way Reed Gallagher made an offer. The kind of offer he was used to making and wasn't used to having refused. But this time, he wasn't giving an order. He was asking. Noelle looked at him, then at Rook. The dog lifted her head and looked at her from the middle of the path, her tail wagging lightly. Noelle nodded. All right, for her. Not for him. For her. Reed understood the difference. He took a business card from the pocket of his suit jacket and set it on the old plastic table on the porch. My number. If anything happens, call. Then he stepped down from the porch, walked past Rook, who was still lying in the middle of the path. He stopped for 1 second, his hand touching the dog's head lightly, then continued to the car. Boone started the engine. The car rolled away. Reed sat in the back seat and looked through the glass. In the rearview mirror, Rook had already stood, turned back into the house, and lain down beside the puppy on the cushion. Noelle stood on the porch, watching Reed's car leave, the business card in her hand. She turned it over. There was only a name, a phone number, no title, no company. Reed Gallagher, a line of digits, nothing else. 2 days later, Reed came back. No call in advance, no warning. The car parked out on the road. Boone stayed inside, and Reed walked in alone. Noelle opened the door and didn't look surprised. She stepped aside and let Reed in. Rook was lying on the porch, and the moment she heard the familiar footsteps, she stood at once. The mastiff went straight to Reed, pressed her muzzle into his hand, then lay down right beside his feet when he sat in the plastic chair on the porch. Rook rested her head on Reed's shoe, her muzzle against the toe of it, her eyes half closed. An old habit. Exactly like the evenings when Reed used to sit working in his private office, while Rook slept beneath the desk with her head on his shoe. It had been the same 3 years ago. It was the same now. Reed sat still, saying nothing. He looked at Rook lying at his feet, then looked out toward the yard, where the puppy was toddling after a butterfly. Noelle was inside the house. He heard her washing dishes, clearing the table, then silence. The second time Reed came was 4 days later. The third time was 3 days after that. Then, every 2 or 3 days, the black car would park outside Noelle's house. Boone would stay in the car, and Reed would walk in. Every time he came, Reed sat on the porch, with Rook lying close to his feet, her head on his shoe. He didn't talk much. Sometimes he didn't say a single word. He only sat there, looking at Rook, watching the puppy run around the yard, watching Noelle care for both dogs with a rhythm he was beginning to know. In the morning, she changed Rook's bandage. At noon, she cooked separate food for Rook and the puppy, with a larger portion for Rook because she was still nursing. In the afternoon, she sat on the porch reading, while Rook lay in the sun, and the puppy crawled around her feet. She talked to Rook in a soft, steady voice. The kind of voice Reed had never heard anyone use with his dog before. Not a commanding voice. Not a voice overflowing with affection. Just the voice of someone speaking to a living creature she respected. Stay still now. Let me change your bandage. Your leg's better today. Rook lay still and listened, her tail wagging lightly. Reed sat a few meters away, watching that scene, and said nothing. One night after his 4th visit, Noelle sat on her bed, took out her phone, and typed Reed Gallagher's name into the search bar. The results appeared at once. Reed Gallagher, CEO of Gallagher Holdings, one of the largest real estate and construction companies in the Texas region. There were photos on the company website, photos in a few local business articles. On the surface, everything was completely legal. A successful businessman, private, rarely seen in the media. Noelle skimmed through a few articles and found nothing unusual, but the next time Reed came, she looked out toward the road and saw Boone. The large man stood beside the car, not leaning against it, not sitting, standing straight, his eyes not on his phone, not on the sky, but sweeping slowly from one end of the road to the other. then sweeping back again. The stance of a man trained to guard, not the stance of a driver waiting for his boss. Noelle looked at Boone, then back at Reed, who was sitting on the porch, stroking Rook's head. A real estate CEO didn't need someone standing guard like that. She knew something wasn't normal. But she looked down at Rook. The dog was lying close against Reed's feet, her head on his shoe, her eyes half closed, her body completely relaxed. Rook wasn't afraid of this man. Rook trusted him with a kind of absolute trust that 3 months of living wild hadn't erased, and Noelle trusted Rook. That dog had lived in the woods long enough to know who was worth trusting and who wasn't. If Rook could lie quietly at Reed's feet like that, then Noelle didn't need to know more. Not yet. One afternoon, Reed arrived earlier than usual. The sun was still out, golden light filtering through the trees and spilling across the front yard. Rook was lying on the porch, and the puppy was trying to climb onto her belly, only to keep slipping back down, rolling across the wooden floor before trying again. Reed sat in the chair, watching it. Noelle brought out 2 cups of coffee, placed one on the table in front of Reed, then sat down in a chair 1 seat away from him. No one said anything. There was the faint sound of wind, the puppy's soft little whimpers, and Rook's steady breathing. A comfortable silence, without strain. Reed looked at Rook, looked at the puppy, then spoke without meaning to. He didn't look at Noelle. His eyes stayed on the yard. The night I lost her, I heard her bark once, just once, then silence. His voice was low and even, not shaking, but slower than usual. The kind of slow that belonged to someone saying something he had never said out loud before. Noelle didn't turn her head to look at him. She didn't ask what night, what happened, or why. She looked at Rook and said, "She's here now." 4 words. Enough. Reed said nothing more. Neither did Noelle. They sat there until the sun went down, the coffee turned cold, and the puppy fell asleep on Rook's belly. Reed stood, nodded to Noelle, and walked back to the car. Boone started the engine and let the car roll forward. When they reached the end of the dirt road, Boone looked into the rearview mirror and said, his voice low, "Someone followed us here. Twice now." Reed looked into the rearview mirror from the back seat. On the road behind them, about 300 meters away, a car was parked by the roadside with its lights off. Reed didn't answer. The car parked by the roadside that night wasn't there by chance. It belonged to one of Troy Beckett's men. Troy Beckett had once sat at the same table as Reed Gallagher. 2 years earlier, Troy had controlled the entire underground freight operation along Interstate 10, from San Antonio to El Paso, operating under the protection of Reed's network. They weren't friends. In that world, there were no friends. But they were allies, the kind of allies who both benefited from keeping the relationship intact. Until Reed discovered that Troy had sold transport route information to a rival group from the east. It wasn't a rumor. It was concrete evidence, clear and undeniable, placed on Reed's desk by Boone on a Tuesday afternoon. Reed didn't call Troy in to ask questions. He didn't give him a chance to explain. That night, everything Troy controlled disappeared. Troy's partners each received 1 phone call, short and simple, and before daylight, not one of them was still taking Troy's calls. The transport route moved into the hands of Reed's people. Warehouses were locked. Accounts were frozen. Troy woke up the next morning and realized he had nothing left. Not slowly, not piece by piece. Everything, gone in one night. That was how Reed Gallagher handled betrayal. No noise, no bloodshed. Just one clean cut, neat and final, leaving the other man to understand for himself what had happened. Troy understood, and Troy didn't forget. 3 months earlier, 3 cars blocked Reed's convoy on a forest road outside Austin. That night hadn't been an accident. It hadn't been a coincidence. Troy had organized it. Troy had paid for it. Troy had chosen the place, chosen the time, chosen the method of the ambush. The target was Reed, but Reed survived. And the only thing Troy managed to take from that night was Reed's dog, a Neapolitan Mastiff that had leapt out of the car and fallen down the forest cliff. Troy didn't know whether the dog lived or died. He didn't care either. To Troy, that night was a failure. Reed was still alive, still in control of everything, and Troy still had nothing. But Troy was patient. He didn't leave Texas. He lay low, kept a small group of loyal men close, and waited for Reed to make a mistake, waited for an opening, and that opening had appeared 3 weeks ago. Troy's men had been watching Reed for a long time, but there had been nothing unusual to exploit. Reed went to work, held meetings, went home, everything regular, everything tightly protected, until one afternoon, Reed suddenly canceled his schedule, got into the car himself, and had Boone drive straight south of Austin. Troy's men followed. For the first time, Reed's car didn't go home, didn't go to the office, didn't stop at any familiar location. It stopped in front of a small house at the edge of the woods. Reed got out and went inside. He stayed for nearly an hour. Then he left. Troy's men recorded the address. The second time, 3 days later, Reed returned to the same address. The third time, 4 days after that. Each visit was the same. Boone drove, Reed went into the house, stayed, then left. A pattern repeated itself. Troy's men reported back. Troy listened, in no hurry. He had the house investigated. The results came back within 2 days. Noel Ashford, 27 years old, veterinarian, employed at a small suburban clinic, living alone, no family, no relatives in the area, no security system, no registered weapon, no connection whatsoever to the business world or the underground one. An ordinary person. Completely ordinary. Troy didn't know exactly what the relationship was between Reed and this woman. It could be romantic, it could be business, it could be something else, but that didn't matter. What mattered was that Reed Gallagher, the man who never broke his schedule, the man whose every minute of the day was calculated, was repeatedly going to a small house in the outskirts to see a woman who lived alone and had no protection. Anything that made Reed behave unusually was a weakness, and weaknesses existed to be exploited. Troy called his men together. He didn't give any specific order. He only said it briefly. Apply pressure. Let her know she was in someone else's line of sight. And let Reed know he wasn't as invisible as he thought. 3 days after the afternoon, Reed had sat on the porch drinking coffee with Noel. He didn't come. No call, no message. But Noel didn't wait, either. She had grown used to Reed's rhythm. He came when he came, left when he left, and explained nothing. That afternoon, Noel got off her shift early and came home before 4 o'clock. She sat on the porch, changing the bandage on Rook's leg. The wound had almost fully healed, the new pink skin drawing closed, no longer swollen. The puppy lay nearby, gnawing on a rubber bone Noel had bought at the clinic. The sun was soft, the wind moving through the treetops. The afternoon as quiet as every other afternoon on this forest road. Then Rook lifted her head. Noel was rolling up the gauze when she felt the dog's body change beneath her hand. The shoulder muscles tightened, the ears rose, the nose pulled in the air quickly. Rook hadn't growled yet, but her entire body had shifted from relaxed to alert in less than a second. Noel looked in the direction Rook was staring. 2 men were walking along the narrow path from the road into her yard. Not Reed, not Boone. 2 men she had never seen before. They were dressed ordinarily, jeans, light jackets, nothing remarkable. But the way they walked wasn't ordinary. Slow steps, even, shoulders straight, eyes not looking around, but fixed on Noel on the porch. The walk of men who knew exactly what they had come here to do. They stopped in the middle of the yard, about 5 meters from the porch. The man in front was taller, with close-cropped hair. He looked at Noel, then at the dog, then back at Noel. He opened his mouth, his voice ordinary, not shouting, not harsh, flat and controlled. "We're looking for Reed Gallagher. Heard he comes here often." Noel stood from the porch chair. The roll of gauze was still in her hand. She looked at the 2 men and didn't answer right away. She didn't know who they were, but she knew one thing. Ordinary people didn't come to her house asking about Reed Gallagher in that voice. The man in front continued, still flat and controlled. "You don't need to worry. We only want you to pass along a message. Tell Gallagher Troy says hello. That's all." He said that's all, but he didn't turn away. He stood there, looking at Noel, waiting for a reaction. The second man stood a little behind him, his eyes sweeping from the porch to the road, then back again, the same kind of sweep Boone made when he stood guard outside Reed's car. Noel recognized that look. She stood still. She didn't retreat into the house. She didn't say yes or no. She only stood there, on her own porch, looking at 2 strange men standing in the middle of her yard asking about a man she had only known for a few weeks. And right then, Rook stood. The mastiff didn't rise slowly the way she usually did. Rook sprang up fast, all 4 legs bracing against the porch floor at once, her body lowered, her head down, her eyes fixed on the 2 men in the yard. A growl came from inside Rook's chest, low, steady, continuous. Not the kind of growl Rook had once given Noel in those first days, wary and uncertain. This was another kind of growl. Deeper, heavier, the growl of a dog trained to protect. The same growl Rook had made before leaping out of Reed's car on the night of the ambush 3 months earlier. Protective instinct. But this time, Rook wasn't protecting Reed. Rook stepped in front of Noelle. The dog stood between her and the two men. More than 50 kilograms of muscle and bone. The scar on her shoulder clearly visible. Her broad muzzle parted just enough to show her teeth. Rook stared straight at the man in front. Not blinking. Not backing down. Behind her, the puppy sensed the change in the air, burrowed into the corner of the porch, and went silent. The man in front looked at the mastiff. He didn't move for a few seconds, assessing. The dog was larger than he had expected, and she wasn't barking wildly like an ordinary house dog. She was growling steadily, low and deep, her body ready. The kind of dog experienced men knew better than to take one more step toward. The second man placed a hand lightly on the first man's shoulder, a signal. The first man gave a faint nod and stepped back. 1 step, then 2. He looked at Noelle one last time and said, "It's just a message. Make sure you pass it along." Then the 2 men turned their backs and walked out toward the road. Not hurrying, not running. Their steps were as even as when they had arrived. They got into the car. The car rolled away. Gone. Rook stood there until the sound of the engine had faded completely. Then the dog turned back, walked to Noelle, and pressed her muzzle into Noelle's hand. Noelle looked down at Rook. She placed her hand on the dog's head. Her hand was trembling, only slightly, but it was trembling. She stood on the porch of her own house. The afternoon was still quiet, the wind still moving through the treetops, the puppy still lying in the corner of the porch. Everything looked exactly the same as it had 5 minutes earlier, but it wasn't the same anymore. Noelle knew it. She looked at Reed's business card stuck to the refrigerator in the kitchen, visible through the glass door, only a line of name and phone number. She took out her phone and dialed the number. The phone rang twice. Reed answered. Noelle spoke briefly. "Someone came to my house. They mentioned your name, and a man named Troy." The other end went silent for 1 second. Then Reed said, "I'm coming now." He didn't ask who they were. He didn't ask what they had said. He didn't ask whether Noelle was all right. Just, "I'm coming now." And then he hung up. 20 minutes later, Reed's car parked in front of Noelle's house. This time, Boone wasn't the only one there. A second car stopped close behind them, and 2 men got out, standing on both sides of the road, their eyes sweeping the surroundings. Boone stood beside Reed's car, his arms folded across his chest, looking around, then toward the house. Reed stepped onto the porch. Noelle was sitting in the old chair, in the same place where she sat every day. Rook lay close beside her, her head resting on Noelle's lap, her eyes open. The puppy was asleep in Noelle's arms. Noelle looked up when Reed approached. She didn't stand. Her face was normal, not panicked, not tearful. Only her eyes were a little different. The eyes of someone who had just seen something she had only ever heard about before. And now it had stood right in the middle of her yard. Reed sat down in the chair across from her, looked at Noelle, waited. Noelle told him. Briefly. 2 men. They had come around 4 o'clock in the afternoon. They hadn't done anything. They hadn't touched her. They had only said they wanted to pass a message to Reed Gallagher, that Troy said hello. Rook had stepped in front of her. They looked at Rook and then backed off. That was all. When Noelle finished, she sat still. She didn't ask anything. Didn't demand an explanation. She simply told him exactly what had happened, then stopped. Reed listened from beginning to end without interrupting. When Noelle stopped, he didn't speak at once. He stood, stepped down from the porch, and walked into the middle of the yard. He stood there with his back to Noelle, looking toward the dirt road that led out to the main road, right where Troy's 2 men had stood a few hours earlier. Reed stood there for nearly a minute. Silent, Noelle watched his back from the porch. She saw his shoulders rise slightly as he breathed in, then lower as he breathed out. Slowly, controlled. Then he turned back, stepped onto the porch, and sat down. His eyes met Noelle's, and for the first time, she saw something in them she had never seen before. Not anger, not coldness, something closer to regret, but heavier than that. Reed said, his voice low, "This shouldn't have happened to you." Noelle didn't nod, didn't shake her head. She looked straight into Reed's eyes and asked, her voice calm, not trembling, unlike her hand a few hours earlier. "Who are you? Really? Not, "What do you do?" Or, "What do you have to do with those men?" She asked, "Who are you?" The kind of question that went straight to the root, without circling around it, without giving Reed the chance to answer with a business card or a CEO title. Reed looked at her. The silence stretched for a few seconds. Rook lay between them, her head still on Noelle's lap, her eyes on Reed. The puppy wriggled in Noelle's arms, then fell asleep again. Reed opened his mouth. "Not a good man." He stopped. Not because he was searching for the right words. He stopped because it was the truth, and the truth didn't need decoration. Then he continued, "But I'm a man who won't let this happen again." He didn't explain who he was. Didn't say whether Gallagher Holdings was a front or the real thing. Didn't explain who Troy was, why Troy had mentioned Inim, or why men had come to her house. He didn't say the word Mafia, or any other word that belonged to that world. Only 2 sentences. Not a good man, but one who wouldn't let this happen again. Noelle listened. She looked at Reed. Then she looked down at Rook. The dog still lay quietly, her head on Noelle's lap, her eyes still turned toward Reed. Calm, trusting. Just like every time Reed came and Rook lay beside him, her head on his shoe, her body completely relaxed. This dog had lived with Reed before she had lived with Noelle. This dog knew who Reed was, who he truly was. Knew more than any article or company website could ever tell Noelle. And this dog, after everything, still lay beside him without fear. Noelle said softly, her eyes still on Rook, "Your dog stood in front of me this afternoon. She didn't need you to explain." She lifted her gaze and looked at Reed. "Neither do I." She didn't say, "I trust you." Didn't say, "I accept it." Didn't say, "Go away," or "Stay." She said she didn't need him to explain, the same way Rook didn't. Whether she trusted him or not, she would decide for herself, by what she saw, not by what he said. Reed looked at her. He nodded. Slowly, lightly, once. Then he looked down at Rook lying between them. The dog who, 3 months earlier, had thrown herself into the dark to protect him. The dog who, that afternoon, had stood up to protect this woman. The same instinct, the same loyalty, but now Rook had 2 people to guard. And for the first time, Reed didn't know whether that should make him feel relieved or afraid. Reed sat in the back seat, his eyes turned toward the window. The car moved along the forest road toward the main road, trees sliding past on both sides, and night had already fallen. Boone drove without asking anything. He had worked with Reed long enough to know when to speak and when to stay silent. Now was the time to stay silent. The 2 security cars followed behind them, their headlights steady in the rearview mirror. Reed didn't look at the mirror. He looked outside without truly seeing anything at all. In his mind, there was only one image. Rook lying on Noelle's lap, her head resting against Noelle's leg, her eyes closed, her whole body completely relaxed. Peaceful, the kind of peace Reed had never seen in Rook before. In the 3 years Rook had lived with Reed, the dog never truly slept deeply. She would lie under Reed's desk, her head on his shoe, but her eyes were always half open, her ears were always alert. Any sound outside the door, any unfamiliar footsteps, any car stopping nearby, and Rook would lift her head, her body tense and ready. That wasn't Rook's fault, that was the life Reed had given her. A life where everything around them could become dangerous at any moment. Rook had been trained to stay alert, taught to protect, raised in a world where even a dog wasn't allowed to let her guard down, and Rook had done well. So well that on the night of the ambush, that instinct had driven her out of the car and into the dark to protect Reed. So well that it had nearly killed her. But at Noelle's house, Rook was different. Reed had seen it clearly during his visits. Rook lay on the porch with all 4 legs stretched out, her belly exposed, the way a dog only lies when she feels completely safe. The puppy climbed onto its mother's belly, slipped down, climbed back up, and Rook didn't move, only breathed steadily. When Noelle passed by, Rook wagged her tail without opening her eyes. When a car sounded out on the road, Rook lifted her head and looked for 1 second, then lay back down. Not tense, not ready, just looking, then letting it go. For the first time in her life, Rook was living like an ordinary dog, not a guard, not a weapon, not a shield of bone and muscle for a Mafia boss. Just a mother dog lying on a porch, caring for her baby, eating, sleeping, and resting in the sun. Ordinary. Reed thought about that on the drive home. If he brought Rook back, she would return to her old life. Lying beneath his desk, ears alert, eyes half open, ready to leap up at every unfamiliar sound. Sitting beside him in the car, her body tense, scanning the world around them, going with him to places no dog should have to go. And maybe, one night, there would be 3 cars blocking the road again, gunfire again, and Rook would leap out again. The last time, she had survived. The next time, there was no guarantee. Reed looked at the empty seat beside him in the car. Rook's place. Empty for 3 months. He had wanted to fill that seat for 3 months. Had searched for 2 months. Had kept the collar on his desk. Had kept the space empty. All of it waiting for Rook to come back. But now he asked himself, come back to what? Back to sitting inside an armored car? Back to lying in a room where the door was always locked 3 times over? Back to keeping watch all night for a man whose enemies never ran out? Or staying on that old wooden porch, where the late afternoon sun filtered through the trees, where the puppy ran around the yard, where Rook could sleep deeply without needing to keep one eye open? Reed didn't answer that question tonight. But he knew that before he could answer it, he had to deal with Troy. Because as long as Troy was targeting Noelle, then no matter where Rook was, the dog wouldn't have peace. The car arrived at Reed's house. Boone turned off the engine. Reed sat for a few more seconds, then opened the door and stepped out. Before going inside, he spoke to Boone, his voice as flat as it always was when giving an order. Call me tomorrow morning with a list of every partner still doing business with Troy Beckett. All of them. Boone nodded. He didn't ask anything else. The next morning, Boone placed the list on Reed's desk at 7 o'clock. 4 names. The 4 people who were still doing business with Troy Beckett after everyone else had walked away 2 years earlier. 4 people keeping Troy alive, keeping him funded, keeping him staffed, keeping him strong enough to send 2 men into the yard of a woman who lived alone and have them speak Reed Gallagher's name. Reed looked at the list. 4 names. Not many, but enough. He finished his coffee, set the cup down, and began making calls. The first call lasted less than 3 minutes. Reed called Harmon, a transport contractor operating in the Dallas area, the man who provided logistics for Troy's routes. Reed didn't threaten him, didn't say Troy's name. He only said Gallagher Holdings was expanding its northern transport route, and he wanted Harmon as an exclusive partner. The only condition was that Harmon cut every current contract with parties outside the Gallagher network. All of them. Harmon understood who parties outside the Gallagher network meant. He agreed within 1 minute. The second call went to Voss, the man who ran a chain of warehouses in San Antonio. Same method. An attractive partnership offer, with one condition attached. Voss didn't need much time to think. Between Reed Gallagher and Troy Beckett, the choice wasn't truly a choice. The third call was more complicated. The third name on the list was Kendrick, a financial broker who worked both sides, legal and not. Kendrick did business with Reed, but he had also kept ties with Troy, because Troy paid higher fees for certain small money laundering services. Kendrick didn't want to cut Troy off easily. He wanted compensation. He wanted Reed to cover the difference. Reed listened, then said briefly, "Choose a side. There's no middle." Kendrick chose Reed. But the cost didn't stop there. The fourth call was the one Reed didn't want to make. The fourth man was Whitmore, a figure with heavy influence in the underground world along the Texas border. Whitmore wasn't Troy's ally, but he wasn't Reed's man either. He was neutral, and that neutrality had kept the region balanced for years. To get Whitmore to agree to cut every connection with Troy, Reed had to give him something. Boone had already prepared the option. Reed knew before he picked up the phone that this call would be expensive, and it was. Whitmore demanded that Reed hand over control of the El Paso route, one of the most profitable routes Reed had held since taking it back from Troy 2 years earlier. That route was a trophy, proof that Reed had beaten Troy the first time. And now, to beat Troy for the last time, he had to give it back. To someone else. Reed stayed silent on the phone for nearly 10 seconds. Boone stood beside him, watching him, saying nothing. Reed thought of the El Paso route, thought of the revenue, thought of its strategic position. Then he thought of the 2 men standing in Noelle's yard the afternoon before, and Noelle's hand trembling on Rook's head. He said, "Fine." 1 word. The call ended. 4 calls. 1 morning. Not a single gunshot. Not one face-to-face meeting. Only 4 phone calls and 1 fine that Reed would never have said if not for what had happened the previous afternoon. Before noon that day, Troy Beckett lost Harmon, lost Voss, lost Kendrick, lost Whitmore. The last 4 names keeping him on his feet in Texas vanished in less than 5 hours. No one called Troy to explain. No one needed to explain. Troy understood on his own. He had understood 2 years earlier when Reed did the same thing the first time. When Reed wanted someone removed from the game, he didn't need to lay a hand on that person. He only needed to take away everything around them and leave them to realize they were standing alone. 3 days later, Troy left Texas. No noise, no announcement. His car crossed the state line heading east, and no one in Reed's network heard the name Troy Beckett again. But before he left, Troy received something. A small box, sealed tight, with no sender's name, left outside the door of the place where he was staying temporarily. Inside was a leather collar, old, dark brown, made from a single piece of cowhide, worn at the edge near the buckle. The collar Reed had kept on his desk for 3 months. With the collar was a white piece of paper, handwritten, with a single line. "Next time, don't touch what's mine." Troy looked at the collar, looked at the note, and he understood that this wasn't only a warning. This was Reed Gallagher telling him he had found what Troy thought he had taken away on the night of the ambush. The dog was alive. Reed had found her. And Troy, the man who had organized that night, was now holding the collar of the dog he thought he had killed, standing in an empty room in a city that wasn't his, with nothing in his hands except a ticket out of Texas. Troy set the box on the table, walked out the door, and didn't look back. 1 week after Troy left Texas, Reed came to Noelle's house. This time, he didn't come empty-handed. On the passenger seat beside him in the car, the seat that had stayed empty for the past 3 months, there was a small box. Boone parked out on the road and watched Reed step out holding the box, but he didn't ask. It was late afternoon. The sunlight had softened, and pale gold light lay across the front yard of Noelle's house. Reed stepped onto the porch. Noelle was sitting in her chair, Rook lying at her feet, her head on Noelle's lap, her eyes closed. The puppy was curled asleep on Rook's belly. A familiar scene. Reed had seen this scene many times over the past few weeks, but today he looked at it longer. Noelle lifted her eyes. She saw the box in Reed's hand, but she didn't ask. She had grown used to the way Reed did things in his own rhythm, speaking when he wanted to speak, staying silent when he wanted to stay silent. She waited. Reed sat down on the porch step beside Rook. He set the box on his lap and opened the lid. Inside was a leather collar, new, crafted from the same dark brown leather as Rook's, but custom-sized for a puppy. Exactly like Rook's old collar, the one now lying in Troy Beckett's box somewhere outside Texas, only smaller. Made to fit the puppy's neck. Reed took the collar out and held it in his hand. The puppy on Rook's belly heard the sound, opened its eyes, wriggled, slid down its mother's belly, and toddled toward Reed. When it reached him, it pressed its nose into his hand, sniffed at the collar, then licked his fingers. Reed reached out and gently fastened the leather collar around the puppy's neck. A perfect fit. The puppy shook its head, feeling the new thing on its neck, then shook again, then forgot about it and crawled onto Reed's lap to lie down. Reed watched the puppy on his lap, his hand lightly stroking the new leather collar. Then he looked at Rook. The mastiff had opened her eyes at some point, her head still on Noelle's lap, but her gaze on Reed, watching him put a collar on her child, watching him stroke her child's head. Rook's tail wagged lightly, slowly, against the porch floor. Reed looked at Rook, looked at the dog he had searched for through 3 long months, the dog whose empty place he had kept in the car, whose collar he had kept on his desk, whose hope he had kept alive when everyone else said she was dead. He had found her. She was alive. Her child was alive, and she was lying on the lap of a woman he had known only a few weeks, more peaceful than she had ever been in the 3 years she had lived with him. Reed kept his eyes away from Noelle when he spoke. He looked at Rook. His voice was low, slow. Not the voice he used in a conference room. Not the voice he used when giving Boone an order. Not the voice anyone in his organization had ever heard. The voice of a man saying something he had thought about for a long time but had never said aloud. "I searched for her for 3 months. He stopped. His hand still rested on the puppy's head. "I thought if I found her, everything would go back to the way it was. She'd come home with me, sit beside me in the car, lie under my desk, like before." He stopped again. Rook looked at him, her tail still wagging slowly. "But she doesn't need to go back to her old life. She needs to be here." Noelle listened. She didn't move. Her hand stayed on Rook's back, feeling the dog's steady breathing beneath her palm. She said softly, "Are you saying she's staying with me?" Reed kept looking at Rook. I'm saying I don't want to take her back to a place where she has to keep watch all night. He breathed in. She deserves to sleep peacefully. The last 4 words hung in the late afternoon air. She deserves to sleep peacefully. Not a philosophy, not a lesson, only a truth that had taken Reed 3 months to see. Rook had protected him with her life, and the price had been the scar on her shoulder, 3 months surviving wild and giving birth alone in the woods. Reed couldn't repay that debt by bringing Rook back into her old life. The only way he could repay it was to let Rook go. Rook lifted her head and looked at Reed. Those heavy, dark brown eyes, the kind Noelle had seen on that first night by the road. The eyes of an animal that had seen too much. Rook looked at Reed, then pressed her nose into his hand, then set her head back down on Noelle's lap. She lay still, eyes closed. Reed placed his hand on Rook's head, left it there, feeling the warmth, the breathing, the rough fur beneath his palm. He knew this might not be the last time he touched Rook, but it was the last time he touched her as her owner. From now on, he would only be the one who came to visit. Noelle looked at Reed's hand on Rook's head. She said, her voice calm but softer than usual, "You can come any time. She's still your dog." Reed didn't answer. He nodded. Once, slowly. Then he drew his hand away from Rook's head, lifted the puppy from his lap, and set it down beside Rook. The puppy crawled straight back against its mother's belly and curled up, the new leather collar catching the last light of the afternoon. Reed stood, lightly brushed off the leg of his pants, looked at Rook one more time. Then he stepped down from the porch and walked back to the car. He didn't look back. Not because he didn't want to, but because he knew that if he looked back, he wouldn't be able to leave. A few weeks passed. Everything grew quiet again on the forest road outside Austin. No strange cars parked by the roadside anymore. No strangers appeared in the yard. There was only the late afternoon sun, the wind moving through the treetops, and the sound of the puppy running around Noelle's yard, the new leather collar glinting on its neck whenever the light touched it. Rook lay on the porch, in the same old place, the place where she had lain since that first rainy night when she had dragged herself to Noelle's house. Her front leg had fully healed, the fur had grown back over the joint, and only a slight limp remained when the weather turned cold. The scar on her shoulder was still there, and it would always be there, but Rook was no longer thin. The mastiff's body had filled out again. The deep folds of skin lay evenly over her frame. Her eyes were brighter, and her breathing had become slow and steady, the breathing of a dog who no longer had to worry about surviving one day at a time. That afternoon, a car drove along the dirt road leading to Noelle's house. Not the familiar black car with Boone behind the wheel. Another car, simpler. The car stopped in front of the yard. Reed stepped out, alone. No Boone, no security car following behind. No one trailing 200 meters back. Only Reed, alone, driving here like an ordinary man visiting an ordinary place. For the first time, Rook lifted her head when she heard his footsteps on the path. Her tail wagged. The dog didn't stand, didn't run out, only lay there, wagging her tail, waiting for Reed to come to her. The way a dog waits when she knows that person will come to her. And she doesn't need to rush out to greet him. Reed stepped onto the porch and sat down on the wooden step, right beside Rook. He said nothing. His hand settled on the dog's head. Rook pressed her nose into his palm, then placed her head on his shoe. An old habit, still the same, always the same. Noelle opened the door and brought out 2 cups of coffee. She set one beside Reed, then sat down in the porch chair, 1 seat away from him. She didn't ask when he had arrived, didn't ask if something had happened today. She only sat, drank coffee, and watched the puppy run around the yard. The puppy chased a dry leaf, tripped over its own feet, rolled once, then got up and kept chasing. The leather collar on its neck hung slightly to one side, because it still hadn't grown enough to fit it perfectly, but it would grow. After the puppy tired itself out, it toddled up the porch steps, crawled to Reed, and climbed into his lap. It turned in 2 circles to find a comfortable spot, gave a long yawn, then curled up, asleep. Reed looked down at the puppy in his lap. Rook's child. The thing he had thought, 3 months earlier, was lost forever. Rook lay at his feet, her head on his shoe. Rook's tail stretched behind her and lightly touched the leg of the chair where Noelle sat, brushing against her ankle. One dog, lying between 2 people, her head turned toward one, her tail touching the other, connecting them without anyone needing to say a word. The sunlight slowly faded. The coffee turned cold. The puppy slept deeply on Reed's lap. Rook breathed steadily at his feet. Noelle sat one chair away, silent, but not distant. Reed didn't speak, but he didn't leave. He sat there, on the old wooden porch steps of the small house by the woods, with the dog he had searched for through 3 long months lying beside his feet, with the child he had thought he had lost sleeping in his lap, and with the woman he still didn't know what to call, but knew had saved the most important thing in his life when he couldn't. Sometimes, what you search for doesn't come back the way you imagined, but it still comes back. The story of Reed, Noelle, and Rook is a reminder that loyalty doesn't need words, that kindness sometimes begins with nothing more than a blanket tossed into the darkness, and that even the strongest people must learn how to let go in order to keep what truly matters. If this story touched you, please hit like to support our channel so we can continue bringing you stories like this. Share the video with the people you love, with animal lovers, or with anyone who needs to hear a warm story today. And if you haven't subscribed to the channel yet, please subscribe and turn on notifications so you won't miss the next videos. We'd love to hear how you feel. What do you think about this story? Which part moved you the most? Please write it in the comments below. We read every line and truly appreciate every heartfelt word you share. We wish everyone watching this video good health, a joyful life, and peace in every single day. Goodbye, and we'll see you again in the next video.